October 17th, 1987. Michael Linders parks his weathered Chevrolet Impala at the trailhead of Pinewood Forest, Oregon. A 29-year-old investigative journalist with the Portland Herald, he adjusts his camera strap and checks his leather-bound notebook one final time. By nightfall, his dinner grows cold at the cabin he shares with his sister. 6 years later, environmental surveyors discover his remains in a remote clearing, hands pierced with industrial nails against an ancient oak tree, positioned in a manner suggesting crucifixion. The crisp autumn air carries whispers through Pinewood, a logging town of 800 souls nestled against a forest older than the nation itself. Michael's breath forms small clouds as he exits his vehicle, scanning the tree line with the practiced eye of someone who has spent 3 months investigating rumors that refuse to stay buried. The metal of his car door closes with a hollow sound that echoes briefly before being swallowed by the dense wall of Douglas firs and western hemlocks. His leather-bound notebook contains 78 pages of meticulous documentation. Shipping manifests with irregularities, permit numbers that don't appear in public records, and names connected by lines of potential conspiracy. Beneath these, coordinates marking locations where timber harvesting shouldn't be occurring according to county zoning regulations. The previous evening, he had spread these materials across their cabin's kitchen table, explaining to Catherine how he was close to connecting the unusual timber sales to offshore accounts linked to Town Council President James Whitaker and the Pinewood Mill's ownership structure. "I need one more piece," he had told her, tapping a location on his hand-drawn map. "The records at the ranger station should confirm what I've found." His eyes had carried that intensity Catherine recognized, the look that had propelled his career from small-town reporter to someone nominated for state journalism awards. 2 days, Kath, then we can take this to the federal authorities." Now Michael advances along the logging trail, his footsteps muffled by decades of accumulated pine needles. The forest embraces him in its cathedral silence, a stillness punctuated only by occasional birdsong and the distant rush of the Clearwater River. His Canon camera hangs from his neck, ready to document any evidence he might encounter. 2 miles behind him, unnoticed during his focused departure, a blue Ford pickup follows, its engine barely audible before the driver cuts it off and parks behind a stand of particularly dense Douglas firs. At 7:15 that evening, Catherine Reeves places 2 plates on their cabin table, the savory aroma of beef stew filling the small space. By 9:30, her brother's portion sits untouched, the surface congealed into a cold, unappealing film. By midnight, she has called the Pinewood Sheriff's Office 3 times, each call met with increasing irritation. "People get turned around in the woods all the time, ma'am," Deputy Collins assures her. "He'll probably walk out when daylight comes." But Catherine knows her brother. Michael never misses appointments, never fails to call when delayed. By dawn, she stands in Sheriff Donovan's office, clutching her brother's spare notebook as evidence that this isn't someone who would simply wander off. The sheriff, a heavy-set man with 27 years on the force, nods with what appears to be appropriate concern, but his eyes never fully meet hers. "We'll send out search parties this morning," he promises, though the crews that assemble consist of only 4 deputies and 2 volunteer firefighters, a fraction of what the town could muster for a genuine emergency. For 9 hours, these men sweep their flashlights across the main trails, calling Michael's name at intervals that grow less frequent as the day progresses. Their boots never venture beyond established paths, despite Catherine's insistence that Michael's notes indicated interest in more remote sections of the forest. Their search ignores the network of unmarked hunter paths that vein deeper into the ancient woodland, where shadows persist even at midday. Catherine follows behind one search group, noting how Sheriff Donovan's radio crackles with coded messages she cannot interpret, how his deputies exchange glances when they believe she isn't watching. By afternoon, the air between them carries a tension she cannot name, but instinctively distrusts. "People leave this town all the time," Donovan states with a shrug, when, after 48 hours, he officially scales back the search. He stands in their cabin doorway, refusing her invitation to enter, his cruiser idling in the driveway. Young folks especially, they find something better and just go. His dismissal comes despite Catherine's presentation of Michael's research materials and the half-written exposé still open on his laptop, the cursor blinking mid-sentence where he had apparently paused. 3 days after Michael's disappearance, Catherine files a missing persons report with the state police. The responding officer takes dutiful notes but explains jurisdiction complexities that require local authorities to lead the investigation. When she calls the Portland Herald, Michael's editor expresses concern, but explains that as a freelance contributor, Michael had been pursuing the Pinewood story on his own initiative, without official backing. The case file grows thin as winter descends upon Pinewood, the manila folder in Donovan's office containing little more than the initial report and perfunctory interview statements. Autumn gives way to snowfall, then spring thaw, then another winter. The town's attention diverts easily to more pressing concerns: the sudden announcement of the mill's closure and the economic devastation that follows, rendering nearly 60% of local families unemployed within a fiscal quarter. Catherine refuses to leave. She takes a position at the local library, scanning newspaper archives for anything that might connect to Michael's research. She distributes flyers that vanish from community boards within hours. She writes letters to state officials that receive form letter responses or none at all. Some nights, in the darkness before dawn, Catherine wakes to the sound of what seems like distant hammering from within the forest. Rhythmic, deliberate blows that carry through still air. When she mentions this to Deputy Collins during one of her weekly visits to check on the case, he suggests grief might be playing tricks on her mind. His smile never reaches his eyes as he adds, "The forest makes all kinds of noises, Miss Reeves. Best not to read too much into them." As months become years, Pinewood shrinks. Families depart for opportunities elsewhere, storefronts empty along Main Street, and the forest seems to creep closer to the town boundaries, reclaiming inch by inch what humans had borrowed for a mere century. Through it all, Michael's Chevrolet remains parked behind the cabin, covered with a tarp that Catherine replaces each spring, a silent sentinel and reminder of unresolved questions that hang in the air like Pinewood's perpetual morning mist. Catherine never stops listening for those nocturnal hammer blows, never stops wondering what they might signify, never imagines that each strike might represent another nail securing her brother's fate in a remote clearing where no search party had ventured. A place where the forest keeps its darkest secrets beneath canopies impenetrable to both sunlight and justice. If you're finding this investigation into the Pinewood case compelling, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. The YouTube algorithm prioritizes videos with high engagement, and your support helps this story reach more viewers who appreciate in-depth true crime analysis. Now let's continue uncovering what happened in the mysterious Pinewood Forest case. The summer of 1993 brought an unprecedented drought to Oregon. Weather stations across the state recorded less than 1 inch of rainfall between June and August, a 93% decrease from seasonal averages. What had once been vibrant forest ecosystems transformed into tinderbox landscapes under constant fire watch. In Pinewood, streams that had run continuously for generations reduced to mere trickles, their beds exposed like bones beneath thinning flesh. The forest floor became a brittle carpet of pine needles and parched moss, crackling underfoot with each step, the sound carrying farther than normal in the unnaturally still air. On August 12th, the University of Oregon dispatched a 7-person environmental assessment team to document the drought's impact on protected wilderness areas. Among them were Thomas Weber, 42, a forestry specialist with 20 years of field experience, and Layla Cho, 36, a hydrologist specializing in watershed management. Their assignment? Measure moisture levels in old-growth sections and assess the drought's long-term implications for timber sustainability. "We weren't supposed to go that far in," Weber would later testify during preliminary hearings. "Our survey boundaries were clearly marked on our permits, 8 miles from the northern logging road, no further." But circumstances altered their course. 3 monitoring stations showed anomalous readings, indicating a potential underground water source that maintained moisture levels despite the drought. Following this hydrological anomaly, Weber and Cho pushed approximately 2 miles beyond their designated survey area into a section of Pinewood forest unmarked on recent forestry maps. At 2:17 in the afternoon, while taking soil samples near the base of a massive white oak estimated to be over 300 years old, Cho's boot caught on something partially buried beneath a layer of fallen leaves. Her initial assumption, a protruding tree root or forgotten logging equipment, was immediately dispelled when her clearing motion revealed an unmistakably human form. The subsequent satellite phone call to authorities, recorded and later transcribed for the case file, captures their professional composure, fracturing under the weight of their discovery. "This is Dr. Layla Cho with the University Environmental Assessment Team. We've found," a pause, breath-catching, "human remains at coordinates 4532 17 north, 123.41.8 west. The body appears to have been here for years." What Weber and Cho had uncovered defied conventional explanation. The human skull stared skyward from the base of the ancient oak, partially obscured by encroaching undergrowth. The body, what remained of it, presented in a macabre tableau, with arms extended outward against the tree trunk. Most disturbing were the industrial nails, each measuring 7 inches in length and 3/8 inch in diameter, piercing both palms into the living wood. The tree had begun growing around these intrusions, suggesting considerable time had passed since their placement. The initial scene assessment suggested ritual elements, notes Detective Sarah Harmon's official report. The positioning cannot be attributed to accident or natural causes. Harmon's arrival at the scene came 3 hours and 22 minutes after Cho's call. Her transfer from Portland's Homicide Division had been finalized just 11 days prior, her unfamiliar face still drawing curious glances from Pinewood's remaining residents. At 34, with 12 years of law enforcement experience, including 7 in homicide investigation, Harmon represented the opposite of Sheriff Donovan's established regime. Methodical where he was cursory, persistent where he preferred closure. "The positioning appears deliberate," she noted into her handheld recorder, the device's small red light reflecting in the gathering dusk as forensic photographers documented the scene from multiple angles. "Subject is positioned in a manner resembling crucifixion, with arms extended laterally against the tree trunk. The nails appear to be industrial grade, consistent with those used in heavy construction or railroad assembly. The victim's clothes had deteriorated significantly under exposure to 6 years of seasonal elements, yet remained identifiable as outdoor gear typical of hikers or field journalists from the late 80s. Fragments of waterproof outer layers, remnants of denim, and decomposed hiking boots still partially laced. A metal watch with its crystal long since shattered had stopped at 8:43, though whether morning or evening remained impossible to determine. Dr. Martin Reynolds, the county medical examiner, conducted preliminary examination at the scene before authorizing removal of the remains. His assessment, delivered in clinically precise terms that nonetheless failed to completely mask his discomfort, indicated death had occurred between 5 and 7 years prior. Evidence of blunt force trauma to the occipital and parietal regions of the skull suggested the victim had sustained significant head injuries before the positioning against the tree. The trauma pattern indicates at least 3 distinct impacts, Reynolds noted, pointing to fracture patterns visible once foliage had been cleared. The victim was likely unconscious or already deceased when positioned against the tree. The nail placement would have required considerable force and precision, inconsistent with self-infliction. During the 4-hour crime scene processing, Harmon noted details others might have overlooked. Approximately 7 feet above the remains, unusual symbols had been carved into the tree bark, patterns distinct from known local indigenous markings or common forest vandalism. Their edges had weathered through years of exposure, yet remained distinctly intentional, approximately 1 inch deep into the bark, with measured spacing between characters. The markings appear to have been carved with a narrow blade, possibly a hunting knife, Harmon dictated. They represent neither English letters nor numbers, but demonstrate intentional patterning consistent with symbolic communication. At 6:47 that evening, forensic technician Jeffrey Morales carefully extracted a leather wallet from the rotted remnants of what had once been Jean's pockets. Inside, protected somewhat by the folded leather, a water-damaged but still legible Oregon driver's license bore the name Michael Reeves, with an address matching a rental cabin at the edge of Pinewood. The expiration date, December 7th, 1990, had long since passed. The discovery sent immediate ripples through multiple jurisdictions. Harmon requested the case file on Michael's disappearance, only to find it contained barely 12 pages, most consisting of Catherine's increasingly desperate statements and Sheriff Donovan's dismissive responses. No evidence had been collected, no search grid established beyond the most accessible trails, no follow-up interviews conducted with potential witnesses after the initial 48 hours. As twilight descended on the clearing, portable lights casting harsh shadows across the scene, Harmon watched county workers carefully freeing the body from its wooden crucifixion. The nails required specialized extraction tools, the wood having grown partially around the metal in the intervening years. The sound of each extraction, a reluctant creak followed by sudden release, carried through the unusually quiet forest, as if the trees themselves held their breath during this intrusion. "We'll need to notify next of kin," Harmon told her newly assigned deputy, Marcos Rodriguez. "The file mentions a sister who never left town." "Catherine Reeves," Rodriguez confirmed, consulting his notepad. "She works at the library, never stopped asking questions about her brother." As the body bag was finally zipped closed and carried carefully along the narrow path toward the waiting vehicle, Harmon stood alone in the clearing for several minutes, her flashlight beam playing across the symbols carved above where the body had been found. She took detailed photographs, then reached out to touch the weathered indentations in the bark, feeling their deliberate depth and precision. The forest seemed to close around her in that moment, the drought-weakened trees still somehow imposing in their ancient patience. For the first time in her career, Harmon felt distinctly unwelcome in an investigation scene, as if the forest itself resented this intrusion into long-held secrets. The sensation, professional detachment momentarily suspended by instinctual unease, would return repeatedly throughout the investigation that followed. What had begun as a routine drought assessment had unearthed a 6-year-old homicide, setting in motion an investigation that would unravel threads woven deep into Pinewood's history, revealing connections between power, belief, and silence that had allowed a killer to remain hidden in plain sight among the dwindling population of a dying town. Catherine Reeves sat motionless in the Pinewood Sheriff's Department interview room, the institutional green walls bearing witness to 6 years of stoic persistence. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face as she clutched her brother's laminated press badge. Portland Herald, Michael Reeves, staff photographer, its corners worn smooth from years of being carried in her pocket like a talisman. Across the metal table, Detective Sarah Harmon spoke with measured precision, detailing the circumstances of the discovery in technical language that somehow made the horror more bearable. The remains were positively identified through dental records and personal effects, Harmon explained, sliding a manila folder across the table containing the official identification report. I wanted you to hear the details from me directly before rumors spread through town. Catherine's hands remained steady as she traced the outline of her brother's photo on the press badge. 6 years, she whispered. 6 years of Sheriff Donovan telling me Michael simply left town. 6 years of being called the crazy sister for refusing to believe it. Her eyes, clear and focused, met Harmon's. I knew. I always knew something had happened to him in those woods. The vindication came entwined with resurgent grief, a complex emotional tapestry that Catherine navigated with the same determination that had sustained her through 23 formal requests for investigation updates and 78 letters to state and federal authorities. He was looking into illegal logging permits and financial irregularities at the mill, Catherine explained, rising from her chair with sudden purpose. Everything is still at the cabin. I saved it all. The statement carried neither triumph nor accusation, merely the factual tone of someone long accustomed to being dismissed. The following morning, Catherine retrieved a cardboard filing box from beneath the floorboards of Michael's untouched bedroom. Labeled in his precise handwriting, Pinewood Investigation, Primary Sources, the box contained 5 notebooks, 17 rolls of undeveloped film, and 327 pages of photocopied documents that Sheriff Donovan had dismissed years earlier as amateur conspiracy theories. Michael believed something wasn't right with the timber contracts, Catherine explained, as Harmon examined the materials spread across the cabin's kitchen table. He found permit numbers that didn't match official records, logging in protected areas, and money moving through accounts that didn't make sense for a struggling mill. For 3 days, Detective Harmon immersed herself in Michael's investigation, converting the small conference room at the sheriff's department into an analytical workspace. Red string connected photos to documents, mapping relationships between Town Council President James Whitaker, mill owner Victor Prescott, and 27 separate instances of harvesting in protected forest areas. The falsified permits coincided with offshore wire transfers. 8 transactions between 1986 and 1987, totaling $4,300,000 to numbered accounts in the Cayman Islands. Michael was methodical, Harmon noted to Deputy Rodriguez on the second day. He wasn't building conspiracy theories. He was documenting a conspiracy. The financial patterns revealed systematic extraction of value from Pinewood's resources, funneled away from the community through increasingly sophisticated channels. Michael had traced shell company formations, documented county zoning board meeting minutes where protected areas were quietly redesignated, and photographed trucks leaving the mill yard at unusual hours with loads covered by tarps rather than standard restraints. On August 21st, Harmon interviewed Edmund Keeley, a former mill worker who had operated heavy equipment at Pinewood Lumber for 22 years before the closure. Their conversation took place not at the sheriff's department, but at Keeley's small farm 10 miles outside town, a deliberate choice that spoke to Harmon's growing wariness about conducting the investigation under the watchful eyes of local authorities. They called them special harvests, Keeley explained, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug as they sat at his kitchen table. Always conducted at night, always in areas marked off-limits on the regular cutting maps. His voice lowered, despite the privacy of their location. Security was different those nights. Armed men in trucks without Pinewood lumber markings. Workers brought in from outside. None of us locals were allowed near those operations. 4 more interviews with former mill employees corroborated Keeley's account, each adding details about unusual operations conducted primarily during new moon phases when natural darkness provided additional cover. 3 described seeing Whitaker present during these operations, though always observing rather than participating directly. While Deputy Rodriguez pursued these testimonial threads, Harmon engaged forensic accountant Diane Powell from the state attorney's office to analyze the mill's financial records. Powell's preliminary findings, delivered 7 days into the investigation, contradicted the narrative that had shaped Pinewood's economic collapse. The mill remained profitable through 1988 and 1989, Powell's report stated. Despite claiming financial distress as justification for its closure in 1990, internal documents show continued timber harvesting and processing, with product shipped through shell companies based in Singapore and Paraguay. The official books showed declining revenue while the actual operation maintained consistent production volumes. The breakthrough came on August 25th, when Harmon discovered something overlooked in the original investigation. Michael's camera, still containing exposed film, had been logged as evidence but never processed. The 36 exposures, carefully developed under Harmon's supervision by the State Crime Lab, provided visual confirmation of what had previously been only documented in text. Frames 17 through 22 showed heavy equipment operating at night in a protected grove 8 miles northwest of the main logging roads, an area marked as ecological preserve on county maps since 1973. Frames 23 through 27 captured a meeting in the same location, Whitaker and Prescott standing with 3 unidentified men before what appeared to be an ancient stone formation, partially embedded in the forest floor. The formation, roughly circular with vertical stone slabs arranged in a pattern suggesting deliberate placement, matched no known indigenous structures documented in Oregon archaeological surveys. The men's attention focused not on the timber, but on the stone configuration, with one photograph showing Prescott gesturing toward specific markings on the central stone, while the others looked on with evident interest. The stones weren't in any of the formal logging documentation, Harmon noted, as she examined the photographs under magnification. Not a single official forest survey mentioned this formation. The final photograph on the roll, slightly underexposed, but still discernible, showed a close-up of one stone bearing symbols remarkably similar to those carved above Michael's body. The connection between the ancient formation and the ritualistic elements of Michael's death crystallized the investigation's direction. Most revealing was a notation in Michael's final notebook, dated October 15, 1987, 2 days before his disappearance. A quote, carefully transcribed and underlined twice. "Some things in these woods are worth more than timber." The statement was attributed to a conversation Michael had overheard between Whitaker and an unidentified third party, described only as the collector. The margins contained Michael's own analysis. Not just about logging permits, something about the stones. C mentioned artifacts and historical value repeatedly. W concerned about exposure and discretion. Meeting scheduled at Ranger Point tomorrow. Must document. Catherine identified Ranger Point as a lookout 6 miles into the forest, less than 1 mile from where Michael's remains would eventually be discovered. The notation represented his last documented intention, the final breadcrumb on a trail that had led him directly to his death. As August drew to a close, the investigation expanded beyond Pinewood's boundaries. Harmon secured search warrants for Whitaker's residence and Prescott's office at the lumber company's regional headquarters in Portland. The evidence suggested Michael had uncovered not merely financial crimes, but potentially something more sinister. A conspiracy connecting timber extraction, archaeological artifacts, and ritualistic elements that culminated in murder. "He got too close," Catherine said quietly as she helped Harmon organize the timeline of Michael's final days. Her brother's press badge lay between them on the table, a silent witness to the truth he had pursued at ultimate cost. Whatever they were hiding in those woods, it was worth killing to protect. The carved symbols above Michael's crucified body presented a puzzle beyond standard investigative resources. On September 3rd, Detective Sarah Harmon drove 120 miles to meet Professor Eleanor Matthews at Oregon State University's Department of Anthropology. Matthews, 67, had spent 4 decades documenting occult practices throughout Pacific Northwest history. Research often dismissed by academic peers as fringe scholarship. Harmon spread photographs of the tree carvings across Matthews' cluttered office desk. Afternoon light filtered through narrow windows, illuminating dust particles that danced between case files and academic journals. The professor adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, leaning forward to examine the images with practiced scrutiny. "These aren't random vandalism," Matthews confirmed, her finger tracing the angular patterns. "I've seen variations of these symbols before." She crossed to a metal filing cabinet, retrieving an archival folder containing yellowed newspaper clippings and hand-drawn illustrations from the 19th century. These symbols resemble those used by a splinter group that broke from mainstream logging industry families in the 1880s, Matthews explained, placing her documentation alongside Harmon's photographs. The similarities were undeniable: concentric circles bisected by vertical lines, triangular formations with internal markings, and recurring patterns resembling stylized trees. "They called themselves the Stewards," Matthews continued, producing a fragile journal page protected in archival plastic. "Their belief system merged frontier Christianity with older European folk practices and selective appropriation of indigenous concepts. They believed certain trees held power that could be transferred through blood sacrifice, particularly those growing above what they called the old stones, potentially prehistoric sites they considered channels to natural energy. Matthews's research documented 7 suspicious deaths between 1882 and 1910 in logging communities across Oregon and Washington, all bearing elements similar to Michael's murder. Each victim had been found positioned against trees, though earlier cases involved ropes rather than nails. All victims had been outsiders who had shown interest in specific forest locations. The practice appeared to die out in the 1920s, Matthews noted, or perhaps simply went underground as modernization made such rituals harder to conceal. The historical connection provided Harmon sufficient grounds to expand the investigation. Judge Caroline Weber signed expanded search warrants for properties owned by Whitaker, Prescott, and 3 other Pinewood council members with family ties to the original mill founders. Sheriff Donovan's resistance to the expanding investigation crumbled when these warrants uncovered damning evidence in a hidden wall safe behind Whitaker's home office bookcase. Among financial documents and foreign passports were ceremonial objects: a hand-carved wooden box containing 7 industrial nails identical to those used on Michael's body, a leather-bound book written in cipher, and a hammer with distinctive wear patterns that forensic analysis would later confirm matched the impact marks on the nails extracted from the crime scene. The DNA analysis confirmed trace elements of Michael's blood on the hammer head, lab technician Davis reported to Harmon on September 12th. The wood particles embedded in the handle match the species of oak where the body was found. Simultaneously, forensic accountants uncovered financial transactions that reframed the entire understanding of Pinewood's economic collapse. The international wire transfers identified in Michael's notes connected not to timber exports, but to private collectors specializing in rare artifacts. Between 1985 and 1992, 17 separate transactions totaling $23 million had been processed through Whitaker's offshore accounts, all from buyers associated with private museums and occult collections. They weren't selling lumber, forensic accountant Powell explained during the case briefing. These payments coincide with shipping manifests for specialized antiquities and heritage specimens, all exempt from standard customs inspection through diplomatic channels. Documentation recovered from Prescott's Portland office revealed a black market operation trading in objects believed to hold occult significance. Shipping records disguised as timber exports detailed carefully extracted stone fragments, soil samples from specific forest locations, and botanical specimens harvested during new moon cycles. The mill closure was cover, Harmon explained to Catherine as they reviewed the expanding case files in the secure conference room. It allowed them to operate without scrutiny once the town had largely emptied, harvesting these artifacts while eliminating anyone who discovered their operation. The evidence suggested Michael had stumbled upon their extraction operation while investigating what he believed was merely financial corruption. His photographs of the stone formation had sealed his fate, documenting sacred sites that the group had protected through generations of secrecy. Federal agents arrested Whitaker at his Lake Oswego estate on September 17th. The 11-room mansion, purchased with proceeds from the artifact sales, contained a hidden basement room accessible only through a concealed entrance in the wine cellar. Inside, agents discovered hundreds of stone fragments, soil samples in hermetically sealed containers, and journals documenting ritual activities dating back to 1962. Prescott was apprehended attempting to board a private plane to Vancouver. Unlike Whitaker, who maintained rigid silence through 97 hours of interrogation, Prescott cracked after just 17 hours in federal custody. His confession, recorded on 16 hours of audio tape, revealed a generations-old belief system centered around the forest's supposed power nexus. According to Prescott, 7 families had maintained the tradition since Pinewood's founding, performing rituals they believed ensured their prosperity and influence. "We are caretakers," Prescott insisted in the recordings, his voice alternating between defensive justification and religious fervor. "The stones were here before any of us, before the indigenous people, before European settlement. They mark power points that feed the forest, and the forest feeds us in return." He described rituals conducted on specific calendar dates, involving blood offerings to activate artifacts extracted from the sites. The economic windfall came not from the timber itself, but from selling these activated objects to wealthy collectors who believed in their supernatural properties. "The sacrifice is necessary," Prescott stated during hour 11 of his confession. "The trees growing from those sacred grounds need blood to release their power. It's been our way since the beginning." When pressed about Michael Reeves specifically, Prescott became evasive, claiming only that the journalist was trespassing on sacred ground and witnessed what outsiders aren't permitted to see. He referred to the crucifixion as the traditional offering, without acknowledging personal involvement, though cell phone records would later place him at the location on the night of Michael's disappearance. On September 23rd, federal agents and archaeological specialists began excavating the clearing where Michael had been found. Ground-penetrating radar identified anomalies consistent with archaeological deposits extending approximately 20 feet below surface level. Core samples confirmed human activity dating back at least 2,000 years, with evidence of continuous ritual use across multiple cultural periods. Most disturbing were the human remains discovered at varying depths throughout the excavation site, evidence of multiple ritual sacrifices spanning centuries. 3 sets of remains showed positioning and nail markings similar to Michael's case, while older remains displayed different but equally ritualistic arrangements. The forest itself seemed to breathe easier as the excavation progressed, as though relieved of a long-carried burden. Weather patterns shifted unexpectedly, bringing gentle rain to break the drought precisely as the primary evidence collection concluded. A coincidence that even the most rational investigators found noteworthy in their field reports. As Harmon supervised the collection of final evidence samples, Deputy Rodriguez approached with Catherine Reeves, who had requested to see where her brother had been found. Standing at the edge of the clearing, Catherine observed the excavation with composed dignity, her hand resting lightly on a nearby tree trunk. "He found the truth," she said, quietly. "It just wasn't the truth he thought he was looking for." October 17th, 1994. Exactly 7 years since Michael Reeves disappeared, 1 year since his remains were identified. The morning fog clung to Pinewood Forest like memory itself, persistent, obscuring, yet gradually yielding to clarity. Catherine Reeves stood at the edge of the clearing, autumn leaves crunching beneath her boots, her breath visible in the cool air. The forest had begun reclaiming the disturbed earth where federal investigators had excavated not only the truth about Michael, but 3 additional victims spanning decades. The site bore little resemblance to the crime scene photographs that had dominated national media for months. Nature's resilience manifested in new undergrowth, mushroom clusters, and seedlings pushing through soil once disturbed by forensic teams and archaeological units. Life reasserting itself over the space where death had been enshrined as ritual. Detective Sarah Harmon approached along the newly maintained trail, manila folder tucked under her arm. Her promotion to lead investigator of the Pacific Northwest Ritual Crimes Task Force had come with recognition that the Pinewood case represented not an isolated incident, but a pattern requiring specialized attention. 11 similar cases across Oregon, Washington, and Northern California now connected to the same network of occult artifact trafficking. The Bureau formally closed Michael's case file yesterday, Harmon said, handing the folder to Catherine. I wanted you to have the final report before it enters the permanent archives. Catherine accepted the document without immediately opening it. The weight of the folder, 78 pages documenting the investigation's conclusions, represented more than procedural closure. It contained vindication of her 6-year vigil and evidence that Michael's work had been instrumental in dismantling an international network that had operated undetected for generations. There's something I never included in the official statements, Harmon said, her professional demeanor softening slightly. Your brother's notes mentioned he felt watched by the forest itself. His last journal entry described eyes in the bark and whispers between branches. I dismissed it as poetic language at first, but after spending months in these woods, she paused, looking up at the ancient canopy. Sometimes I understood what he meant. The trials had concluded 3 months earlier with multiple convictions. James Whitaker received 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Victor Prescott's cooperation agreement resulted in 25 years with potential early release in exchange for identifying international buyers and co-conspirators. Most surprising to Pinewood residents was Sheriff Donovan's conviction for obstruction of justice and evidence tampering, revealing how deeply the conspiracy had penetrated local institutions. 7 participants in the ritual network remain unidentified, Harmon noted, indicating a section of the report. The investigation continues, but we believe the primary Pinewood operation has been completely dismantled. They walked together toward the massive oak where Michael had been found. The tree stood as silent sentinel, its bark now bearing fresh growth where investigators had removed sections containing the ritualistic carvings for evidence. New growth sprouted around its base, vibrant moss and wild flowers reclaiming ground once marked by tragedy. Affixed to the trunk at eye level, a small bronze plaque now commemorated Michael's work rather than the cruel symbolism of his killers. Michael Reeves, journalist, 1958-1987. His pursuit of truth brought light to darkness. The settlement from the civil suit against Whitaker's estate was finalized last week, Catherine said, touching the plaque gently. I've established 2 things with it: a journalism scholarship at Portland State focusing on environmental investigation, and a conservation trust to permanently protect these 500 acres of forest. Her voice remained steady, practical. It seemed the right way to ensure both Michael's professional legacy and this land remain preserved. The forest around them had changed in subtle ways since the investigation. With Pinewood Timber's operation permanently shuttered, the woods had experienced their first harvest-free year in more than a century. Biologists documented increased wildlife activity, understory regeneration, and watershed recovery, as though the ecosystem itself recognized its liberation from both commercial exploitation and ritual desecration. The FBI's archaeological assessment had documented 47 distinct ritual sites throughout Pinewood Forest, dating back centuries. Rather than publicize these locations, federal authorities had quietly secured them, respecting their historical significance, while preventing them from becoming macabre attractions for dark tourism or copycat practitioners. "Michael's camera is being returned next week," Harmon said as they walked back toward the trailhead. The Bureau kept it for additional analysis of the undeveloped film, but they've cleared it for release now that all trials are complete. Catherine nodded, appreciating the return of this final personal effect. His eye always saw what others missed. That's what made him both an excellent journalist and a target. The memorial dedication was scheduled for noon. A small gathering of journalists had assembled near the forest entrance, representatives from the Portland Herald, where Michael had worked, investigative reporters who had followed the case, and journalism students from the newly established scholarship program. Their presence represented the professional community acknowledging one of their own who had paid the ultimate price for his work. Catherine addressed them briefly, her words measured and direct. "The truth doesn't stay buried forever," she told the assembled press, "even when powerful forces conspire to silence it. My brother believed in the power of documentation, evidence, and persistent questioning. Those principles eventually brought him justice, though far too late." She declined to answer personal questions about her ordeal, instead focusing attention on the environmental protection now afforded to Pinewood Forest. As the formal proceedings concluded and attendees departed, Catherine and Sarah remained behind, standing at the forest's edge as twilight approached. The setting sun filtered through western hemlocks and Douglas firs, casting long shadows that stretched like memory itself across the forest floor. "Will you stay in Pinewood?" Harmon asked. Catherine nodded. "This is where I fought for him. This is where I'll honor him." She gestured toward the forest. "Besides, someone needs to make sure those trees continue to have a voice." The wind picked up as darkness began its gradual descent, rustling through the canopy with a sound almost like whispered conversations. Both women stood in silence, listening to the forest's ancient voice. The sound carried neither menace nor comfort, merely presence, the objective witness of entities that had stood through centuries of human activity, both sacred and profane. The ancient trees of Pinewood Forest continued their silent vigil, bearing witness to both humanity's capacity for darkness and its enduring pursuit of justice. Their roots intertwined with secrets not yet revealed and truths not yet discovered. Some stories the forest would keep, others it would gradually surrender to those patient enough to listen. As Catherine turned to leave, she placed her hand briefly against the bark of a towering cedar, not in superstition, but acknowledgement of something Michael had understood before anyone else. The forest itself had been both crime scene and witness, victim and preserver of evidence. Its patient persistence had ensured that eventually truth would emerge from the shadows, carried on whispers between branches to those willing to hear.